One of the things that tragically sometimes happens is that we look at the 1920s as a time of amazing cultural changes, and then the 30s as the time of the Great Depression and poverty and sadness, and don't really talk about cultural changes again until like the 1950s or 60s when we get to fun music again. And that's really a terrible way to look at things because there are all kinds of very important things happening during the 1930s that we have to really understand if we want to understand any of the political or economic or even social things that unfold later in the World War II era or beyond. But one of the things that we have to understand is that pretty much everything happening in the 30s is shaped through the lens of economic collapse. I mean, it's hard not to be when so many people around you are unemployed, and even those who aren't unemployed are afraid of losing their jobs. So let's take a moment to break down what's happening here in the 30s. Some of the most important things that start to unfold during the 30s actually happen in politics, which is usually not super interesting, or at least not as interesting as things in like new music or cars or whatever, but is crazy important here if we want to have any idea of what's happening in politics even today. Because what happens during the 30s is that the New Deal that Roosevelt and his brain trust and his wife come up with to try to get us out of the Great Depression fundamentally changes the course of politics because people pretty much either are on board with this or they're not. But even more than that, politicians, especially Southern politicians, will vote for aspects of the New Deal that they don't like because those things don't really apply to them, and then use essentially the favor of having voted for that thing as a tool to get people in Congress to do favors for them later. That's how politics works. And then later, when the things that they voted for that they didn't think applied to them start to apply to them, like support for labor unions, that becomes a whole big deal. But as for now, in the 30s, the deals that are made during the New Deal lead to new political realignments that will shape politics for the next several decades and eventually lead to the beginnings of what we consider sort of, but really not totally accurately, the flip flop in American politics that led to the Republicans of Lincoln becoming the Democrats of today and vice versa. Okay, so these are three major groups that see some kind of political realignment in part or in a massive way during the New Deal era. This isn't to say that there aren't other groups out there or that everyone within these groups up and switches sides, because remember, no group is a monolith. There are all kinds of reasons why someone might be politically aligned with one particular party that has to do with a mixture of things like race, gender, socioeconomic status, geography, family history, disability status, religion, or even literally just the fact that they don't like a certain candidate. But speaking in generalities, African Americans tended to shift towards the Democratic Party during the New Deal because New Deal programs helped them. This isn't like rocket science. Now, this isn't like flawless, though. For starters, African Americans tended to vote for Republicans since the end of the Civil War, since Republicans were the party of Lincoln, and Republicans were the ones who passed our Reconstruction Amendments, or the 13th through 15th Amendments. But to be totally honest, the Republican Party hadn't really done anything to help them since then. After 1877 and the end of Reconstruction, when they pulled the military out of the South, the vast majority of African Americans lost the ability to vote because of the Klan and general voter suppression tactics from their state governments. And Republicans and the federal government weren't exactly standing up to say, hey, we should do something about this. And so when the Great Depression hits and Roosevelt's New Deal programs offer some kind of relief for African Americans, they see that as a step forward. Now, I want to make it abundantly clear that this was a step in the right direction, but there was still rampant discrimination even within these programs. For example, the National Recovery Administration, which at one point set minimum pay scales, had set separate pay scales for black and white workers where black workers made less. The Federal Housing Authority, which was supposed to help people find low-cost housing, refused mortgages to black families that attempted to move into white neighborhoods. The Civilian Conservation Corps created segregated camps for black and white workers to live in that may have been separate but were most definitely not equal in their living arrangements. And the Agricultural Adjustment Acts required acreage reductions for landowners that put sharecroppers out of work. By the 1930s, only about a third of sharecroppers were black, but one can presume that they would have been the first ones let go by a white landowner and likely forced to pay any remaining debts to the best of their ability before leaving, and then turned out to a world where they were unlikely to find another source of income. Despite this, though, the fact that most federal programs required some form of non-discrimination on the surface, meaning that those receiving federal funds had to at least hire minority workers, was already leaps and bounds better than what conditions were like for some of these communities before the programs existed. That's not to say that people wished for the Depression to continue on. A lot of people, even if they were working for the money that they got, still saw the jobs that they were doing as at least tangibly like a handout. But when faced with a situation where the President of the United States, a Democrat no less, could have chosen to do nothing for them, African Americans tended to see Roosevelt's actions towards their community favorably, and that led to a shift in support towards him and his party. For Native Americans, the Roosevelt administration attempted to provide economic relief by restoring aspects of tribal sovereignty. In 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act, sometimes referred to as the Indian New Deal, required the federal government to buy any available land next to existing reservations to return to tribes and end the allotment system from the Dawes Act. It also provided for Native nations to form their own governments. However, because the entire point of this was to restore a sense of self-determination, it didn't force any of the nations to actually abide by the IRA. The Navajo Nation, for example, didn't. Just a year before, the Navajo watched as the Commissioner of Indian Affairs allowed their herds of sheep and goats to be slaughtered by government officials, shot and then left to die and rot, all in the name of preventing soil erosion. So they weren't particularly thrilled to jump on the government's big project the next year when it rolled around. And they weren't the only ones to see a problem with this. Just like we've seen in the past with Cherokee in the 1830s, the tendency any time indigenous nations dealt with white people in the federal government is that those privileged people in the tribe who speak English and are better educated in Western knowledge rose up and became more powerful. And this is exactly the tendency that happens a century later in the 1930s as well. But one of the things that the IRA does really well is create a legal framework. Whether Native Americans sign on to it or not, the law exists in U.S. federal code and creates a statute for indigenous self-determination. And that's significant because it's a benchmark for progress that would take a considerable amount of effort to undo. Our third group here are labor unions. Clearly, we've seen from the Gilded Age and World War I that the government's relationship with labor unions has been touch and go for most of our history. In terms of labor, FDR is really one of the more labor-friendly presidents we've had. On top of all this, his job-creating programs, Roosevelt signed things like the National Industrial Recovery Act in 1933, which explicitly allowed for collective bargaining in industrial jobs. And then in 1935, he signed the Wagner Act, which upheld the rights of private sector employees to collectively bargain using unions and go on strike. In the same year, the American Federation of Labor experienced a split in their union because some workers argued that their needs weren't being represented. The CIO, or Congress of Industrial Organizations, branched off in order to specifically meet the needs of unskilled industrial workers. The two labor unions fought constantly about tactics and membership, and only rejoined in the Cold War era when both were under attack during the age of McCarthyism. When it comes to labor and the Democratic Party, we need to be very careful to point out that Democrats at this point are not necessarily on the same page here. This is essential for us to understand if we want to understand later why people are supposedly flipping parties, because this doesn't happen overnight or all at once. It's actually a bit of a gradual process that starts here. We have to understand that issues of race and labor are extremely intertwined here in the New Deal. So in the South, we've got a whole bunch of Democrats in the state governments and Southern Democrats in the federal government. And Roosevelt is a Democrat, but he's from New York. So in theory, these people are all on the same team, but they also have very different agendas here based on what they know their constituents want and need. Plus, as president, Roosevelt's constituents are literally everyone. And so what happens is that Roosevelt wants to pass legislation to create jobs for people, all the people, and legislation that's friendly to labor. But he knows that he needs the votes of Southern Democrats in Congress in order to get that done. So in order to do that, he's going to have to make some kind of concessions to them. This is like politics 101. And so when he tells them that he wants to do these job bills, they're like, fine, but our white Southern constituents are never going to go for black people working alongside them or making as much money as them. So you're going to have to do X, Y, and Z things to make them chill with Jim Crow laws. And so that's what he does, because in Roosevelt's mind, when the entire nation is in a state of economic collapse, something is better than nothing. Plus, he absolutely can't pass laws from the federal government that give jobs to some people and not others based on race. That's literally not constitutional per the 14th Amendment. So then he's like, okay, I'd like to do a bill that helps out labor unions. Now, our Southerners in Congress at this point in time, like specifically this point, don't really care too much about industrial labor unions because they're not a problem for them. Like the South isn't just overflowing with factories. So they're like, okay, fine. But again, these provisions, since they come from the federal government, can't exclude people based on race because of the whole pesky 14th Amendment again. So they tell him he can pass all the labor legislation he wants, but he has to include exclusions for people in industries including agriculture and domestic work, which super conveniently for them just happen to be the two areas where most African Americans work. What a coincidence. And so once Roosevelt agrees to add all of the Jim Crow stuff to his laws, the Southern Democrats are perfectly happy to sign off on them because now those laws don't threaten their segregated way of life, at least not yet. This will become a problem for them after World War II when industrialization does hit the South. And then all of these laws that they were happy with in the 30s are then laws that they're suddenly not happy with, but we'll get to that later. By the middle of the 1930s, Roosevelt's New Deal had critics on both sides of the political spectrum. Conservatives argued relentlessly that his programs were an infringement on individual liberties. Some tried to have the programs declared unconstitutional in the courts and were sometimes successful. And yet others on the other side of the aisle argued that Roosevelt wasn't doing enough. Critics came from all walks of life, but the most vocal often use the radio to broadcast their message to wide audiences across the country. Catholic priest Father Charles Coughlin, for example, used the radio as a platform to share his conspiracy theories that bankers and Jews were conspiring to take down the little guy, whoever that might be in each message. He originally supported the New Deal, but quickly turned against Roosevelt when he refused to support the free coinage of silver. And from there, his talks were mostly just anti-Semitic rants all the way up to World War II. His presence on the airwaves was part of a larger trend of religious leaders beginning to widen their influence, though, beyond just the reaches of individual congregations and weekend services in the 20s and 30s. We saw this same trend beginning with Billy Sunday in the 20s and the fight over fundamentalism and modernism. And while theology, politics, and economics have never really truly been separate in American history, the emergence of radio preachers brought such messages into a new medium and increased the average American's exposure to formal religious messaging. Another, perhaps more traditional critic of Roosevelt was Louisiana Governor and then U.S. Senator Huey Kingfish Long. He also falls into the category of people who thought that the New Deal didn't go far enough to helping people. As governor of Louisiana, Long was really kind of an eccentric dude. He was known for being really strict with money and had a private army fully stocked with submachine guns, which was kind of terrifying. But the people of Louisiana loved him because the guy got stuff done. Like, for the only time in the history of Louisiana, the roads were actually taken care of. And in the only time in the history of any state ever, maybe just to guess, he increased funding to things like schools. Long knew that a lot of the people in his state were not super well off, and so he either genuinely cared about taking care of the people or was a great politician and actually met their needs, probably a mixture of the two. But either way, he was actually very good at his job. And in 1932, he was really supportive of Roosevelt. But once New Deal programs started rolling out and he realized that like half of these programs wouldn't apply to the people of his state, especially as agricultural workers and or African Americans, he was pretty pissed. So he pretty quickly jumped ship. And in 1934, he rolled out his own program called Share Our Wealth, where he promised to put a 100% tax on incomes over $1 million and a tax on inheritances over $5 million. His whole idea was that those taxes would then be distributed evenly to the people of the United States, generating an annual income of at least $2,000 per family. In essence, it's like a Robin Hood plan: take from the super wealthy to give to the poor. At the time, this idea was actually pretty popular. By the start of 1935, a poll within their own party showed that Huey Long would take in about 4 million votes as an independent candidate if he decided to split from the Democrats and make a run for the presidency. He never got that chance, though. Long was assassinated in September 1935 by the family member of a state judge he opposed. The other really huge political scandal really, of the New Deal era was Roosevelt's court packing scheme. So we know that Father Coughlin and Huey Long both thought that the New Deal didn't go far enough in helping people out who were living in poverty. The Supreme Court represented the opposite side of the political spectrum. They had far more conservative approaches to Roosevelt's federal programs. And so in 1937, Roosevelt has comfortably won re-election, which is putting it mildly. He really crushed the competition. But he's nervous that Social Security is going to be on the chopping block in the Supreme Court, who had already knocked down the NRA and the first version of the AAA. So he goes to Congress with this idea of maybe adding some justices to the court. And his whole logic is that most of the court is like old as dirt, which you can see here in this photo. And so they couldn't possibly understand the needs of a young and diverse American population. So his plan is that they'd add one new seat for every justice who is 70 and a half years old and above, which would be 6 justices, which is absolutely nuts when you consider that there are only 9 justices to begin with. And super heckin' convenient when you remember that he is the one who gets to do the appointing of these new justices. Now, Congress 100% did not go for this. Even most of the people in his own party saw that this was ridiculous. And one has to wonder the degree to which Roosevelt was actually serious himself, because in the end, the justices on the Supreme Court changed their tune and left Social Security well enough alone when a case challenging the law came before them. But no matter if he was serious or not, this isn't just Roosevelt playing politics. This was an abuse of power. It's using the power of one office to influence the decision of another branch of the federal government. That kind of violation of separation of powers, even if one thinks they're doing it to do something good for the American people, isn't how our democracy is meant to work. And for this whole charade, Roosevelt is really just pummeled in the press. Really, the cartoons on this one, like you can see here on the right, practically draw themselves. Here you've got our 9 justices sitting on the Supreme Court, and then the 6 new justices sitting behind them, all of which are Roosevelt, since he'd presumably be adding new justices to the court who think and act exactly like him. There are other cartoons where the entire court is just people that are him, or other cartoons where Roosevelt is smashing the court with a giant fist or using the Constitution as a weapon to destroy the court. They really just go on and on. In addition to mainstream politics, one of the things that we see happening in the 30s is a crackdown and even criminalization of certain aspects of life. Because at the same time that the federal government sought to expand political and economic rights to more Americans, certain sectors of society actively worked to crack down on what they saw as respectable social norms. One of the really obvious places this happened was within the LGBTQ plus community. And the reason for that was largely because the person vocally waging war against them was in the federal government. It was the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. In an editorial written in the New York Herald Tribune, Hoover argued that the public perceptions of LGBTQ individuals as harmless was wrong, and that they were really going to turn into the, quote, loathsome mutilator and murderer of tomorrow, or, quote, a dangerous predatory animal preying upon society. In the laws passed to crack down on the LGBTQ community, the assumption was essentially always that children were targets of victimization. Within a decade, homosexuality and other forms of what government officials like Hoover considered sexual deviance became synonymous with terms like child molester and sex offender. And these terms were used as political fodder and radicalized to prevent anyone who might want to even consider helping out the LGBTQ community from trying. It would be impossible for someone to recover socially or politically from being attached to a group considered sex offenders by the rest of the world. And it wasn't just Hoover who stirred this frenzy. He's just one of the most obvious examples, given his platform as a public official and his ability to do very tangible damage as a leader in the Justice Department. But everyone from church officials to school boards to the Boy and Girl Scouts of America employed and reinforced these stereotypes for decades. The other major criminalized area was race and sexuality, especially in the arts and often intersecting. During the early parts of the 20th century, film took off as a booming industry in the United States, and in the 1920s, silent films were extremely popular as forms of entertainment. By the 1930s, motion pictures were one of the most popular forms of cheap entertainment for most Americans, but the film industry adopted pretty strict codes on what could and couldn't be shown on screen. For example, producers couldn't mock clergy or use the Lord's name in vain, and you better forget about actual cursing. They couldn't show interracial couples, and they had to be careful with what they showed with white couples in general, too. No kissing for longer than 3 seconds, no couples, even married ones, in the same bed, no first night scenes, and then, of course, a whole list of things dealing with drugs and violence. This isn't to say that modern television standards are somehow superior now that we've let loose and show everything that CGI and special effects and looser standards will allow, but more to say that even with these standards, 1930s media still chose to show certain aspects of relationships and sexuality, especially as those intersect with issues of race, and exclude others. For example, in 1918, before the restrictions, Hollywood put out the film Tarzan of the Apes based on the then popular book from 1912. Now, this is not the same Tarzan that you have probably seen in cartoon versions, although to be fair, it's not ridiculously far off. The basic premise here is that you have this family who went on their way to Africa, which where in Africa isn't really said, and on the way they're marooned on an island somewhere on the coast, and their son is adopted by apes on the island after they die. And so this son, Tarzan, grows up and becomes king of the apes before a family friend finds him on the island and reports back to England that he's alive. So then a group of scientists comes looking for him, and one of the daughters, Jane, although why would you bring your daughter anyway, is kidnapped, and then Tarzan rescues her and she falls madly in love with him. Now, notice a couple of things here. One, Tarzan happens to become the king of the apes despite the fact that he isn't an ape. It's literally the most presumptuous white person thing ever to think that in the animal kingdom, where this guy literally is the only human there and should probably have been eaten, that he would magically become the top of the pyramid. And two, for all intents and purposes, Tarzan should be gross to Jane. Dude has been living with literally wild animals for his whole life. How does he even know how to communicate with her? He clearly doesn't speak English or anything, really. So the entire premise here, whether intended or not, is that by the virtue of his whiteness, he is acceptable for her to love. So just to make it clear, in the same year that this book came out, 1912, Black Americans were being lynched by white people at a rate of almost 1 every 6 days. That's more than 1 every week. And the entire thinking here during the Progressive Era or Gilded Age, whichever way you want to look at that time scale there, is that they're inferior because they have African genetics, even though pretty much none of them have literally ever stepped foot in Africa, nor have their parents and probably most of their grandparents at this point. Some of them are Ivy League educated, and that doesn't matter. When they literally even look at a white woman the wrong way, they're murdered by white people. But Tarzan over here doesn't even know how to put on a pair of underwear or what his real name is, and Jane's parents are totally chill with them getting cozy in the jungle. This is what white supremacy looks like. Compare that then even to 1933 in the film King Kong, or even to the version of this film with Jack Black that came out when I was in high school. And in the media representations of this film, you have King Kong here and our white lady damsel in distress. And they haven't chosen to portray King Kong in any of the scenes where he's on his island getting harassed by white people or in the parts where he's minding his own business. No, they're portraying the parts at the very end where they're shooting him with planes and he's trying to defend himself. These are two opposite portrayals of how Americans handle what they perceive to be the other or the unknown. When that unknown comes at us with white skin, totally fine. We can understand that, and we have patience for that and a frame of reference for that. But when that other or unknown comes at us from somewhere in Indonesia, like King Kong, and doesn't speak our language, we shoot planes at it. Both of these films also reinforce traditional ideas of sexuality and race for their time period. In Tarzan, Jane might fall in love with someone a bit unconventional, but it's perfectly socially acceptable for her to fall in love with a white man, especially one with such a wealthy familial background. In the original King Kong, the damsel in distress here, Anne Darrow, is carried to the top of the Empire State Building because King Kong is in love with her, feelings that she doesn't reciprocate. When he's ultimately killed, she reunites back with her own white male love interest, Jack Driscoll, thus reinforcing that this is the proper relationship she should be seeking. Our final aspect of the 30s worth taking a look at is popular entertainment. I want to point out one major aspect from this time period. In the 1930s, one of the major forms of entertainment that people turn to other than radio and film are pulp magazines. Now, it's totally worth pointing out that pulp magazines aren't invented in the 1930s. They date back to like the 1880s, really. But what's great about them in the 1930s is that they're super cheap, which is great when you're broke. So when they're invented, really, there are a ton of genres of pulp magazines. But by the 1930s, there's really three big types: Westerns, think cowboys and such, detective pulps, and hero pulps. So on the screen here, we have Black Mask, which was a detective pulp. These could vary pretty wildly, but they tended to have some kind of murder mystery vibe to them, and almost always have some kind of damsel in distress angle or female victim. Now, there was a kind of subset to these that were a lot more like scandalous version of the detective pulp genre that were sold like under the counter because they were seen as too sexualized for displaying in public due to the media censorship laws that we just talked about. Although what that would mean today in censorship laws would still probably be quite mild. But in any case, these were one major category. The other big sellers for most people were the hero pulps, like The Spider. Now, I want to be really clear that this is not a precursor to Spider-Man, like I checked. Although they did use two of his enemies, the Batman and the Iron Man, as DC and Marvel characters later on. Duh. What ends up happening with hero pulps in particular is that these tend to blend pretty frequently with comic books. For a while, the two types of publications run alongside each other. Pulp magazines have more words, more like a small book, but eventually comic books won out as the more popular media. A lot of times it seems easy to think of the Great Depression in the 1930s as a time of desolation and poverty and literally nothing else. But while the economic downturn of the 30s was certainly on pretty much everyone's mind all the time, it wasn't the only thing on people's minds. Americans in the 30s lived lives of extreme complexity. They still fought over politics and sports and what to have for dinner, even if their options weren't as plentiful. And they still went out and sometimes had fun, even if their options for that were limited as well. And when it comes to problems of gender, race, economics, and regional identity, those things didn't just disappear. People still had to navigate those issues within their existing problems because life is complex. As we move forward into the World War II era, we'll see how the boom of industry both helped with these issues and created more challenges.